Hello, welcome to the recordings for Contemporary Fiction. This is the lecture on the PowerBook by Jeanette Winterson. My name's Catherine Cox and you can see my email address just there. So if you want to get in touch to discuss anything that I'm talking about today, then you're very, very welcome to do so. Jeanette Winterson is somebody that I've written on quite a bit and I keep returning to sort of through my research. Today I'm going to be focusing in on her novel, The PowerBook, which was written in the year 2000, which is a really lovely cusp for a number of different reasons. This recording is going to be split into three areas. I want, with this initial first recording, to start to give you a little bit of a background to the PowerBook and to Jeanette Winterson as a writer. So Winterson really sort of sprung to prominence with her first novel, her debut novel, Orange is Not the Only Fruit. Now, you may have come across this. This has been a GCSE text for a number of years, and it was also a very popular and well-regarded BBC series. So you might actually want to kind of explore that. Reason being that a number of her books, her first 7 novels, in fact, published from Orange is Not the Only Fruit in 1985 all the way up to the PowerBook in 2000, explored similar themes. Now, what Oranges does, it's what we call a Bildungsroman. It's a novel of maturation. It brings together quite a mundane story, quite a humorous story actually, about a character named Jeanette, who's growing up in Accrington, like Jeanette Winterson. It follows her story, but it splices that story with a number of folk stories, a number of fairy tales. So she wrote a very prominent introduction to that novel, having published the novel and then kind of returned to it later, where she talks about both the simplicity of Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, but also the experimentation. She talks about this idea of the mind not being a motorway, not being linear, but being more akin to a spiral or to a maze. And I'd like you to think about this experience of reading, because I think in the PowerBook itself, it's something that she's really interested in. So her first novel, Oranges, was incredibly successful, sold in high numbers, won the Whitbread Prize. And it established her then as a writer and enabled her to move into this phase of being a writer. Funnily enough, she actually pitched the idea of her autobiography, if you like, Orange is Not the Only Fruit, whilst going for a job interview at a publisher. She didn't get the job, incidentally, but was advised to go away and write up this story. So published through Virago. Her second novel, Boating for Beginners, she's rather sort of distanced herself from it. It's rather a sort of what she refers to now as a comic book, and The Passion, which is the next follow-up, written a couple of years later, 1987, then became a sort of a very prominent part of her work. So once that had been published, once you had the sort of the success of The Passion and then followed up with sort of Sex and the Cherry, there was a period in which she was really sort of reflecting on her writing and making some quite bold statements really about how she viewed the relationship between the books she was publishing. So she's not somebody who writes particularly long books. Her novels are really kind of novellas. They tend to be 150 to 200 pages long, somewhere in that kind of region. And in about the early 1990s, and certainly backed up in a collection of essays called Art Objects from the mid part of the 1990s, she started to talk about this cycle of 7 novels that began with Orange is Not the Only Fruit, and which she intended to kind of extend to the end. And the end of this cycle is the PowerBook itself. So although we're looking at the PowerBook in isolation, what I think is really lovely is the way in which her books kind of map on to this kind of period of contemporary fiction that we're studying. And they may allow us this kind of insight, this development of a writer and of her ideas kind of through that period. So the PowerBook is seen really as a kind of an end point, if you can have an end point on a spiral or a circle. And also a starting off point. So in what direction is this author going to go from 2000 onwards? And funnily enough, you're kind of setting yourself up for a fall there, really, because you're saying, you know, I'm going to continue kind of the same themes. I'm looking to kind of conclude, perhaps without necessarily identifying for her readers or for herself as an author where that new direction was going to come. And funnily enough, the books kind of subsequent to that, we've seen her move into a number of different areas, actually publish most recently a cookbook, a memoir. She's gone into children's literature as well. She's also written a few kind of screenplays and kind of scripts as well. So in what ways PowerBook actually, rather than seen as being an end, is also sort of seen as being a beginning. And we'll come back to the ways in which I think her writing has developed and changed over that period, because I do think it is a significant moment for her as a writer. Now, as I said, the debut novel Orange is Not the Only Fruit plays around with her own biography, her own autobiography, which is a bold, exciting thing to do. But it's also quite a problematic one. It tends to cause authors problems because there's a tendency then, I think, for critics and readers to read you as the character. And although I can't persuade you to go away and read all of Orange is Not the Only Fruit, go and have a look. There's a section called Deuteronomy, the Deuteronomy section in Oranges, which kind of reflects the writing that she uses in Art Objects, in that it's almost essayistic. And what it is, it's a writer writing about her craft. And I think that's really important. So if you're going to work on the PowerBook, I think that section in Oranges would really help you open up a kind of a window onto her thinking about how she uses herself as a character, how she uses history. She talks about it as being a cat's cradle. I don't know if you ever played with cat's cradle as a kid, but it's certainly something that can get knotted up very quickly. So she likes, I think, exploring that kind of knottiness. Now, after this stellar breakthrough, she appeared on Question Time. She was on The Culture Show. She became a kind of a go-to person as a kind of a popular writer and cultural critic. There was a real critical dip, and also potentially a writing dip for her as well in the mid-90s. So most of her writing was pretty well received up until Written on the Body, which I think is actually quite a magnificent novel, actually. But that was poorly received in the UK. Funnily enough, it was the book that made her in America, and she's continued to sell incredibly well on continental Europe, so much so that about 10 years ago she was suggesting that she might just move out there for good to kind of escape the kind of the media attention that's tended to kind of follow her. So the publication of Art and Lies, which is her most experimental, is her most tricksy of novels. Multiple storylines across 2,000 years potentially, reimagining the character Sappho as this lesbian poet, which is very important to her and to her writing, mixing that with kind of quantum physics, so using a lot of kind of ideas and writings of Einstein on time and on space, whilst playing all of this up, wrapping all of this around an opera by Strauss called Der Rosenkavalier, which is all about kind of cross-dressing and cross-gendered identity. So incredibly difficult book, I think, and not one really that critics have yet really managed to kind of get to grips with. So there was a very important review in the Observer, I believe, Nikki Girard, and that was a very negative review. Jeanette Winston and her then partner turned up on Gerard's doorstep to argue the toss potentially about this kind of review, not realising that Gerard was entertaining a dinner party full of journalists, and this led to a kind of a row on the doorstep, which then has gone down in kind of folklore and kind of writerly history as being a writer then perhaps who's kind of out of control. And funnily enough, Winston herself talks about this in an interview with Jaggy in 2004, and kind of says, you know, I really wish somebody had given me an operation to sew my mouth up in about 1992 and kept it sewn up until kind of 1998. So in some ways, she was a very kind of prominent engager with her own writing. It probably didn't help that in '92 she'd recommended her own book as the best book of the year, which, you know, was seen as being maybe kind of a little bit pushy as well. So that's given you a little bit of a kind of a background to kind of her and maybe the ways in which she engages with her writing. I want to say a little bit more though about these kind of repeated themes. I think the themes are really important through the 7 novels. I'd like you actually to think about this. I'd like you to just sort of jot down what you think is really prominent in the PowerBook. So take a few moments, pause this tape, and start to kind of see what comes out for you. Okay, so thanks for doing that, those of you who did. For me, I just wanted to kind of highlight some of the areas that I think she repeatedly returns to. And actually, you know, it's not that long after Valentine's Day. I think let's prominence her detailing and her exploration of love. That for me is probably the most prominent theme that she repeatedly kind of comes back to. And this is love that is not only a kind of a desired love for another partner, for this kind of perfect other, if there is such a thing, this quest for love, but it's also the quest of an abandoned child, an adopted child. So Winterson herself was adopted, and those of you who've read Oranges will be aware that that was not a particularly happy adoptive relationship, and her mother, Mrs. Winterson, becomes this kind of fictionalized monstrous figure through a number of her other works, in a positive way in Sex and the Cherry, and then in a far more negative way. And funnily enough, it's her children's literature, I think, Tangle Wreck, where we get the closest to this kind of very sinister version of kind of motherhood. If you're interested in that, if you want to kind of explore her background, her biography, far more closely, then her memoir from 2014, Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal, would be a great starting off point. And again, talking about a cycle, you know, that kind of maybe doesn't end with the PowerBook. Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal returns to the same territory as Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, and kind of links all of these ideas together. So you may well have additional themes to kind of add to this list there. That's absolutely great, and it may be that you want to kind of track those back through her other writings, or through her interviews as things that she's interested in. She's certainly somebody who makes prominent her experimentation in form and content. And I'm actually going to argue that maybe doesn't go far enough in the PowerBook, that I'm kind of looking for something kind of additionally, maybe something that's kind of more of a hybrid form between the book and between the kind of the future of the book. In about the year 2000, there was quite a prominent cultural commentary around what was happening with kind of digital reading, with the opportunities to read on tablet and to kind of read online. And there was quite a prominent theme running through kind of cultural criticism about this idea of the death of the book. So Winterson was somebody who was absolutely adamant that this was not a period of death, this was not an ending, but this was a phase or a transition or a beginning, a potential to do something different. So she talks about the kind of the progressiveness of literature and what it can do, and she sort of says, you know, we shouldn't be looking backwards, we shouldn't be always thinking about rewriting 19th century novels, we should be looking to the future. And thinking about what technology can do and help us to kind of progress. Now that's quite ironic really, because in particular her novel The Passion does actually explore that kind of 19th century history, a past, a textual past, perhaps as kind of a starting off point. So this is the end of the first recording. I'm going to move now in the second recording to start thinking about some of her experimentations.